Sarah had always been told that humans were a species of little significance. Her people, the Selnar, had long dominated the stars and had little interest in the small races of the universe. She had learned from an early age that humans were weak and primitive. They had barely mastered space travel and were easily crushed by any race with advanced technology. The myth was simple and accepted by every Selnar. Humanity was a relic of a forgotten time. Their ships were old and slow, and they had nothing to offer the galaxy except stories of their past wars and struggles. One day, while patrolling a quiet sector of space, Sarah was monitoring ship traffic when something unusual caught her attention. She thought it was just another asteroid drifting in the distance, but as she focused her sensors, she saw something moving against the backdrop of the dark space. It was a small ship darting between the asteroids with incredible precision. The ship was old and battered, and from a distance it looked like nothing special. But there was something about it that intrigued Sarah. She hadn't seen a human ship in years. Her curiosity grew as the ship moved skillfully through the asteroid field. The ship wasn't fast, but it moved with an unusual grace. Sarah watched as the ship avoided a massive asteroid that appeared out of nowhere. The way it navigated the dangers of space was unlike any human ship she had been told about. Humans were supposed to be reckless and fragile, not capable of surviving such a hazardous environment. She found herself staring at the ship as it disappeared deeper into the field. Zara quickly shifted to a higher orbit to follow it. She wasn't supposed to be here. Her mission was to observe and report, but there was something about this ship that she couldn't ignore. It didn't fit the myth of human failure. It moved as though its crew had done this 1,000 times. The ship's design was old, yet it didn't seem to be falling apart. Sarah checked her instruments to make sure the readings were correct. She had to be sure that she wasn't misinterpreting what she was seeing. As she followed the ship through the asteroid field, she began to doubt the stories she had heard. Maybe the humans weren't as weak as everyone had said. Maybe they had something more to them than was commonly understood. But there was no time to dwell on that thought. The ship had entered an even more dangerous part of the asteroid field. Sarah held her breath as she watched the ship expertly maneuver around several huge asteroids. This was no ordinary crew. This was something different. She could see now that the ship was battered from years of use. The hull had been patched several times. Its engines emitted a faint glow that suggested they were old but still powerful. It was clear that the ship had been through countless struggles. Yet, despite its appearance, it was still intact and navigating one of the most perilous areas of space with ease. Zara's doubts about the myths started to grow. How was this possible? Was humanity truly as weak as she had been taught? Zara decided to observe the ship for a little while longer. She had to see more before making any conclusions. The stories she had grown up with were clear. But what if they were wrong? What if humans weren't the weak and fragile species everyone thought they were? The thought lingered in her mind as she silently followed the ship into the unknown. Sarah stayed in the shadows of the asteroids as the human ship continued its journey through the field. Her sensors tracked every movement with precision. The ship moved slowly but with a steady rhythm. It had a certain confidence in its path that made Tara pause. The ship dodged obstacles with ease and was managing to avoid dangers that would have sent other ships into chaos. She had never seen anything like it. Sarah had been told humans were careless in their space travels. Their ships were supposed to break down easily and their technology outdated. Yet here was this ship barely showing any signs of wear despite the dangers around it. She wondered what kind of crew was aboard. It was one thing to see a ship survive in these conditions, but it was another to understand who was making it happen. Unable to resist any longer, Sarah decided to make contact. She reached out through her communication system and opened a channel to the ship. She expected the usual static or a confused response. Perhaps the crew would be too weak or inexperienced to even respond. But as the connection went live, she was greeted by a calm voice. "This is Captain Marlowe of the Starship Liberty. Who am I speaking with?" the voice asked. Zara's mind raced. The captain's tone was calm, almost casual. There was no panic or confusion in his voice. His response was measured and assured. She had expected something different. The voice didn't sound weak or desperate. Instead, it held a quiet confidence that unsettled her. "I am Sarah of the Excelmar," she said. "I've been observing your ship. You've managed to survive in a dangerous part of space. How?" There was a brief pause on the other end before the captain replied. "Survival is what we do," he said. "It's what we've always done. You could say it's in our nature." Zara was taken aback. That wasn't the kind of answer she had expected. She had thought humans would be frantic or scared in these conditions. Yet this captain spoke as if survival was as simple as breathing. There was no trace of fear in his voice, no hint of weakness. "I don't understand," Sarah said. "How are you able to navigate these hazards so easily? Your ship looks old, and yet it moves with purpose." The captain chuckled softly. "You don't need the most advanced technology to survive. Sometimes you just need to know how to work with what you've got. We've learned to adapt to whatever the galaxy throws at us. Our ship might be old, but it's still running because we take care of it. We use what we have and make the best of it." Sarah couldn't believe what she was hearing. Humans had always been described as a weak species, but here was this captain telling her that survival didn't require strength or power. It required adaptability. Sarah had heard about the resilience of humans before, but hearing it from one of them was different. The captain continued, "We may not have the technology or the strength of some other species, but we have something else. We have a will to keep going even when everything seems lost. We fight because that's what we do. That's who we are." Zara was silent for a moment as she processed his words. She had always been taught to look down on humans. They were supposed to be nothing more than a myth, a species that would fade into history. But now she wasn't so sure. What she had just heard didn't match the stories at all. "Maybe you're right," she said finally. "Maybe I've misunderstood your kind." The captain's voice softened slightly. "It's easy to judge something from afar, but you'll never really know until you see it for yourself." With that, the connection ended. Sarah sat in silence, staring at her screen. Her mind was racing with questions. The myths she had grown up with were being challenged in ways she hadn't imagined. Perhaps humanity was more than just a myth after all. Sarah could not stop thinking about the conversation with Captain Marlowe. His words had echoed in her mind ever since. She had always thought of humans as fragile and unremarkable. But the captain's calm demeanor and his confident words made her question everything she had been taught. She decided to observe more. There had to be more to these humans than she had ever realized. Over the next few days, Sarah kept a close watch on the ship. She followed it as it navigated through more dangerous parts of the asteroid field. The crew was clearly skilled at what they did. The ship moved with an almost effortless grace through the obstacles around it. It didn't seem like luck. It seemed like experience. Sarah wondered how long the crew had been out here. One morning, Sarah watched as a large asteroid suddenly appeared in the ship's path. It was too large for any ship to avoid. Sarah braced herself for what she thought would be a crash. But the ship didn't panic. The crew worked in perfect unison. Within seconds, the ship adjusted its course and narrowly avoided the massive rock. It was a move that would have left most ships destroyed. Yet here was this human ship, maneuvering with precision and skill. Zara's admiration for the humans was growing. But it wasn't just their skill at navigating space that impressed her. It was their calm under pressure. She had seen countless races fall apart at the first sign of danger. But the humans, they didn't hesitate. They didn't panic. They simply worked together and overcame the obstacles in front of them. Later that day, Sarah noticed a change in the ship's signal. The power levels were fluctuating. Something was wrong. She studied the readings and saw that the ship was having trouble with its engine. She could see from her vantage point that the crew was aware of the problem. They were trying to stabilize the ship's systems, but something was clearly failing. Sarah felt a sense of urgency. This was the moment she had been waiting for. The humans were about to face a real test. Would they falter under pressure, or would they show the same resilience they had displayed before? She couldn't tear her eyes away from the screen as she watched them work. Captain Marlowe's voice came over the communication line once more. This time there was a hint of strain in his voice. "We're having a problem with the power grid. All hands on deck. Let's make this work." Sarah had never heard such determination in a voice before. There was no fear. There was no panic. Just a quiet command to fix the issue. The crew moved quickly, but with no sign of chaos. They split into teams, each taking a task to ensure the ship's systems remained intact. Sarah was amazed by how they communicated with each other. They didn't argue. They didn't waste time. They just worked. For hours, Sarah watched as the crew worked tirelessly. The captain remained calm and directed the repairs with a steady hand. Slowly but surely, the ship's power levels began to stabilize. It was clear that the humans had done this before. They had faced similar problems and come out the other side. Sarah's doubts about their weakness were fading with every passing minute. Finally, the ship's systems returned to normal. The crew had succeeded. They had overcome the crisis without losing control. Sarah sat back, stunned. She had witnessed something incredible. These humans were not the fragile creatures she had been taught about. They were survivors, and they had just proven it. Sarah's curiosity couldn't be contained any longer. She had seen enough from a distance. She had watched the ship's crew work together to overcome obstacles and survive against all odds. Now she needed to understand them. She needed to know what drove them. What was it about these humans that made them so different from the myths she had always believed? She decided to approach the ship directly. She knew it was a risky move, but she couldn't ignore the questions burning in her mind. She set a course to dock with the ship. As she approached, she could see the small craft more clearly. The ship was old, patched up in places, but it still held together. There was something about its worn exterior that made Sarah admire it. It had survived longer than many ships twice its age. When Sarah boarded the ship, she was greeted by a group of humans. They were rough around the edges. Their uniforms were not pristine. Their faces were tired, some with stubble, others with visible scars. They didn't look like the elite crews Sarah was used to, but there was a certain strength in their eyes. They had seen things. They had lived through hardships, and they wore those experiences like badges of honor. "Welcome aboard," the captain said with a friendly smile. "I'm Captain Marlowe. You must be Sarah. It's not often we have guests." Sarah nodded but didn't know what to say. She had expected the humans to be cautious, maybe even fearful. But Captain Marlowe's greeting was warm and sincere. There was no hostility, no suspicion, just simple curiosity. "Can I speak with your crew?" Sarah asked. "I want to understand how you do it, how you survive in space with so little." Captain Marlowe looked at her thoughtfully for a moment before nodding. "Sure. We're all just trying to make it through the day. I think you'll find that our crew is a bit like a family. We each play a part. We each do what's necessary to keep this ship flying." Sarah followed him to the crew quarters where a few members of the team were gathered. They were talking, laughing, and working together to fix some minor issues with the ship. The atmosphere was relaxed, far from the tense environment Sarah had expected. The crew didn't seem to be struggling or anxious. They were simply getting the job done. One of the crew members, a woman named Sarah, caught Sarah's eye and waved her over. "Hey there, Sarah," she said with a grin. "You want to know how we do it? Well, we don't really think about it. We just take it one step at a time. It's all about working together. We trust each other." Sarah was taken aback. This wasn't what she had imagined. She had expected to find a crew that was barely holding on, struggling to survive. But here was a group of people who seemed to thrive in adversity. They didn't fear the challenges they faced. They accepted them as part of their reality. Another crew member, a man named James, added, "Survival isn't about being the strongest. It's about being resourceful. It's about finding a way when there seems to be no way. That's what we do. We find a way." Sarah listened closely. She had never heard such practical wisdom. It was the opposite of everything she had been taught. She had been taught that strength and power were the keys to survival. But here were these humans proving that adaptability, teamwork, and determination were just as important. The more she listened, the more she realized that the human crew wasn't simply surviving. They were thriving in a way that Sarah had never thought possible. They had learned to make the most of their situation, and in doing so, had created something far stronger than just a crew. They had created a bond. Zara's perspective on humans began to shift. They were no longer the weak, dying species she had been told about. They were survivors. And in that moment, Sarah began to understand that maybe, just maybe, the myths had been wrong all along. As Sarah spent more time aboard the ship, she couldn't shake the feeling that everything she had been taught about humans was wrong. She had always believed they were weak and unworthy of attention. But here she was seeing something entirely different. The crew was made up of people who had faced unimaginable hardships, and yet they had endured. They didn't seem to have the advanced technology or the strength of other races, but they had something far more important. They had an unbreakable will. Sarah began to hear the stories of the crew. They weren't just soldiers or explorers. They were survivors. Each one had faced battles that would have broken most beings. Sarah, the woman she had met earlier, had lost her home to a terrible war and had been forced to flee with nothing. James, the man who had spoken about resourcefulness, had once been stranded on a desolate planet with no food or water for days. But both of them had made it through. They had not only survived, but had come out stronger. Sarah listened to their stories one by one. Each one was different, but the theme was the same. Humanity didn't give up. They didn't surrender to the odds stacked against them. They fought, not because they knew they could win, but because they had no other choice. She spent hours speaking with the crew, learning about their history. The humans had once been a divided species torn apart by war and poverty. They had lived in cities where the struggle to survive was a daily battle, but over time they had come together. They had worked to build a better future not through violence or conquest, but through cooperation and resilience. Sarah was amazed. She had expected to hear about human weakness, but instead she heard about their strength. The more she learned, the more she realized that the myths about humans weren't just exaggerated. They were completely false. The idea that humans were weak and primitive was nothing more than a story. The truth was that humanity had faced incredible challenges and had survived them. They had done so not by being the strongest, but by being the most adaptable. They had learned to overcome their limitations and thrive in even the harshest of environments. One evening, as the crew gathered around the table for a meal, Sarah found herself sitting with them. She felt a sense of unity she had never experienced before. The humans weren't just surviving in space. They were living. They laughed together. They shared stories. They took care of one another. And through it all, they never gave up. As they ate, Sarah began to question her own beliefs. She had always been taught that her race was the pinnacle of advancement. The Xelnar were the most powerful and the most intelligent. They had conquered the stars and ruled over countless civilizations. But now she was seeing something she had never considered before. It wasn't just about power or technology. The true strength of a species lay in its ability to adapt, to keep going when everything seemed lost. Sarah had always seen her people as the ultimate example of what it meant to survive in the galaxy. But the humans were proving that survival wasn't just about strength. It was about heart. It was about the will to keep fighting even when the odds were stacked against you. She knew now that the myths about humanity weren't just misleading. They were dangerous. They had led her to underestimate a species that was far stronger than anyone had realized. And for the first time in her life, Sarah found herself questioning everything she thought she knew about the universe. The humans had shattered the myth. And in doing so, they had opened her eyes to the true meaning of survival. Sarah's understanding of humanity continued to grow with each passing day. The myths she had once held dear seemed more and more irrelevant as she spent time aboard the Liberty. But just as she began to feel a sense of awe for the humans, she was reminded that danger was always lurking in the vastness of space. It was only a matter of time before something would test the resolve of the crew. One afternoon, as Kara was standing on the observation deck, watching the stars, a sharp alert rang through the ship. The calm atmosphere quickly turned into a flurry of activity. The ship's sensors had detected a hostile vessel approaching at high speed. Sarah turned to the communications panel where Captain Marlowe's voice was already filling the air. "All hands to battle stations," Captain Marlowe ordered calmly. "We've got company. Prepare for evasive maneuvers." Sarah felt her heart race as she watched the crew spring into action. There was no panic in their movements. They moved like they had done this 1,000 times before. Sarah and James worked together at the ship's controls while others ran through the corridors to ready the weapons and shields. Even in the face of danger, they were focused. The hostile ship was closing in fast. Sarah could see it now through the observation window. It was a sleek, menacing craft much larger than the Liberty. Its dark exterior shimmered in the dim light of space. Sarah could tell it was a warship built for combat. She could feel the tension building in the air. "Captain Marlowe," Sarah called out, "what do we do? This ship is much larger and more advanced than yours." "We do what we always do," Captain Marlowe replied without hesitation. "We adapt. We fight back. We survive." Sarah could sense the confidence in his voice, but she couldn't deny the fear that gripped her. The odds were not in their favor. The hostile vessel was heavily armed and had superior firepower. But the humans weren't backing down. They were preparing for a fight they had no reason to win. The Liberty shook as the first blast from the enemy ship struck the shields. Sarah held on tight as the ship jolted. The crew didn't flinch. They immediately began countermeasures. Sarah quickly began recalibrating the shields while James adjusted the weapon's targeting system. Sarah couldn't help but marvel at their ability to stay calm under fire. "Fire the main guns," Captain Marlowe ordered. The ship's weapons roared to life as energy beams shot toward the enemy vessel. The hostile ship fired back with even more intensity. The two ships exchanged blasts, each one shaking the Liberty to its core. Sarah could see the energy readings on her screen. The shields were holding, but just barely. "This won't last much longer," Sarah said, her voice tight with concentration. "We need to outmaneuver them." Captain Marlowe nodded. "All right, James. Get ready for evasive maneuvers. Sarah, hold those shields as long as you can." Sarah could see that the crew was running out of time. The enemy ship was relentless, firing with deadly precision. But just as Sarah thought the situation was hopeless, Captain Marlowe made his move. He barked out orders, his voice steady and commanding. With a sudden burst of speed, the Liberty banked hard to the left, dodging a massive blast from the enemy. The hostile ship followed, but the Liberty was faster. With expert precision, James executed a series of sharp turns and maneuvers that threw off the enemy's aim. The Liberty weaved through the incoming blasts like a dancer avoiding the grasp of a predator. In that moment, Sarah understood. The humans weren't just surviving. They were fighting with everything they had. It wasn't about strength. It wasn't about superior technology. It was about their will to never give up. They were proving it in real time. The battle raged on, but the Liberty had gained the upper hand. Slowly but surely, the enemy ship began to retreat, unable to land a decisive blow. The crew had done it. They had survived against overwhelming odds. Sarah could hardly believe what she had just witnessed. The humans had turned the tide. As the hostile ship disappeared into the distance, Captain Marlowe spoke into the comms. "Well done, everyone. We lived to fight another day." Sarah stood in awe. She had seen human resilience and determination like never before. These were not the weak, fragile beings she had been taught about. They were warriors in their own right. And in that moment, Sarah realized that she had much more to learn about the strength of humanity. The battle had been won, but the feeling of tension lingered in the air. Sarah stood silently on the observation deck watching the stars drift by. The humans were celebrating their victory, but she knew that this was just another day for them. Another test that they had passed. Another challenge they had faced and overcome. It was a realization that shook her to her core. The myths she had been taught, the stories that had been ingrained in her mind, were no longer true. She had been raised to believe that strength, technology, and power were what defined a species. But here were the humans proving that it wasn't those things that made them powerful. It was their heart, their determination, their ability to adapt and survive. These were the qualities that had allowed them to face danger head-on and emerge victorious. Zara couldn't stop thinking about what she had witnessed. She had seen firsthand how they worked together in perfect harmony, how they trusted each other without hesitation, how they never gave up no matter how dire the situation seemed. She realized now that the strength of a species didn't lie in the number of weapons they had or the size of their ships. It lay in their unity, in their spirit. As she stood there, lost in thought, Captain Marlowe approached her. His face was weary, but there was a warmth in his eyes that reminded her of the very resilience she had come to admire. "Zara," he said gently, "you've been quiet since the battle. What's on your mind?" Zara looked at him, unsure of what to say. She had so many questions, so many things she needed to understand. But one thought stood out above all else. "I've been thinking," she began slowly, "about the stories we were told, the myths about humans. I always thought you were weak, that you would be wiped out in the face of real danger. But now I see that I was wrong. You aren't weak. You're stronger than I could have ever imagined." Captain Marlowe nodded. "We aren't perfect, Zara. We've had our fair share of mistakes and failures, but we've learned, we've adapted, and we've survived." Zara's mind raced. Everything she had believed about strength and survival was being rewritten. The more she learned about humanity, the more she realized how little she had known. These humans didn't rely on brute force or overwhelming power. They relied on each other. They relied on their willingness to fight even when the odds seemed impossible. "Is this how you've always been?" Zara asked. "How you survived the wars, the hardships?" Captain Marlowe's eyes grew distant for a moment. "In some ways, yes. We learned through trial and error. We failed, we fell, but we always got back up. It wasn't always easy. It wasn't always pretty, but we never gave up." Zara felt a pang of respect for the humans. They had faced unimaginable struggles, and yet they stood strong. They had faced death, destruction, and despair, but they had never allowed those things to define them. Instead, they had defined themselves. "And what about now?" Zara asked softly. "What keeps you going now?" Captain Marlowe smiled. "The same thing that always has. The will to survive. The belief that we can make things better. That we can build a future together. We fight not because we think we can win every time, but because it's the only choice we have." Zara felt something stir within her. For the first time, she understood. She understood why the humans kept fighting. They didn't fight because they were invincible. They fought because they believed in something greater than themselves. They fought because they believed in the future. As the stars glimmered outside, Zara realized that the myths she had grown up with no longer mattered. She no longer saw the humans as the fragile, weak beings she had once been taught to look down upon. They were warriors in their own right, and their true strength was something she had never fully understood until now. The myths were gone. The truth had been revealed, and in that truth, Zara saw a future she never thought possible. The days following the battle were quiet. The tension had faded, but the feeling of change was still heavy in the air. Zara found herself reflecting constantly on what she had learned. She had come aboard the Liberty with a sense of superiority, believing that the humans were nothing more than a fleeting species. But now, everything she thought she knew had been shattered. The myths were gone. The reality was far more complex and far more impressive. Zara walked through the ship's halls, her thoughts consumed with the crew. She had seen how they worked together, how they trusted each other without question. She had seen their strength in adversity, their ability to adapt when faced with impossible odds. It was a strength she had never imagined possible from such a small and seemingly insignificant species. Captain Marlowe had been right. The humans weren't defined by power or technology. They were defined by their will to survive, their determination. It wasn't their guns or their ships that made them strong. It was their ability to keep moving forward no matter what. She had seen it in their eyes during the battle. When the odds were stacked against them, they had not faltered. They had not surrendered. They had fought with everything they had, and they had won. Sarah knew that she couldn't go back to her old beliefs. She had seen too much. The truth had changed her, but there was still so much more to understand. The humans were an enigma, a species unlike any other she had encountered. She had been taught to believe they were weak, but now she saw the real reason they had survived so long in the galaxy. It wasn't because of their strength. It was because they refused to give up. As the days passed, Sarah became more integrated with the crew. She worked alongside them, learning their ways, adapting to their methods. The more time she spent with them, the more she realized how different her people were. The Xelnar were powerful, yes, but they lacked the unity the humans shared. They were driven by their own strength, their own pride. They didn't rely on each other in the way the humans did. Sarah began to question her own species. She had always believed in their superiority, but now she wasn't so sure. The Xelnar had conquered the stars through strength and fear, but the humans had done it through perseverance, through their willingness to fight for each other and for their future. One day, Sarah found herself sitting with Sarah and James in the crew lounge. They were talking and laughing, sharing stories of their pasts, and for the first time, Sarah felt like she was truly part of something. She wasn't just an observer anymore. She wasn't just an outsider. She was part of this crew, part of this family. James looked over at her and grinned. "You know, Sarah, you've got the heart of a human now." Sarah smiled, unsure of how to respond. She had never thought of herself in that way before. But now, as she looked around at the crew, she realized that maybe there was more to strength than she had ever understood. "I guess I'm starting to understand," Sarah said softly. Captain Marlowe walked in at that moment, his presence commanding attention. He gave Sarah a nod of recognition. "You've learned a lot in a short time, but there's still much more to see. We're always learning, always growing." Sarah looked up at him, a sense of purpose stirring within her. She realized then that her journey wasn't just about understanding humanity. It was about understanding herself, about discovering what it truly meant to survive, to fight, to live. And as the stars stretched out before her, Sarah knew that she had found a new path. A path that no longer relied on myths or assumptions. A path defined by truth, by strength and unity, and by the unyielding will to keep moving forward. The myth of the humans was gone, and in its place was something far more extraordinary. And for the first time, Sarah felt a deep sense of pride. Not in her own people, but in what she had come to understand about the humans. They weren't just survivors. They were something far more powerful. They were a force that could not be ignored. And Sarah was proud to be part of their world.